Hello, hello. My name is Austin, and this is part 4 of the Gentile Times Reconsidered, summarized. In our last video, we traced the development of Nelson Barber's system of prophetic interpretation, his eschatology, and its later adaptations by Charles Taze Russell, and how, later on, Jehovah's Witnesses, namely Joseph F. Rutherford and those who would follow after, would reappropriate the 1914 date. Jonsson titles Chapter 2 of his book, Biblical and Secular Chronology. And as we'll see in this video, it's impossible to have one without the other, at least when we attempt to date events in the Bible by placing them on a chronology alongside our modern period. Jonsson starts this chapter with a quote from an appendix in the 1981 book, Let Your Kingdom Come, published by the Watchtower. And notice the date of this quotation, 1981. At this point, if you've read through the entire introduction to the Gentile Times Reconsidered, you'll know that Carl Olof Jonsson, by 1981, has already presented the findings of this book, all of this research material, to the governing body. And this appendix in Let Your Kingdom Come represents Fred Franz's first attempt to refute Carl Olof Jonsson's findings after he's presented his work. And we're going to circle back around to some of the arguments that Franz makes in this appendix, but notice how he frames the discussion. We are willing to be guided primarily by God's Word, rather than by a chronology that is based principally on secular evidence, or that disagrees with the scriptures. Notice the appeal. Franz is pitting the biblical data against the secular data and claiming you have to choose to either trust the Bible or secular evidence. The problem is that this dichotomy makes absolutely no sense. If you read Watchtower publications, or really any publication dealing with the ancient world, you're going to come across dates. For instance, you'll see the organization say that Jesus was baptized in 29 CE, or that the Exodus occurred in 1513 BCE, and so on. The Bible itself doesn't contain any of these dates. And you can even put aside the issue that the Bible doesn't use this dating system, the CE or the BCE monikers. It doesn't use the Gregorian calendar, which is, of course, a system that comes centuries after the Bible was written. The Bible only provides us with a relative chronology. A relative chronology is a set of dates or time periods that exist within a closed set, a closed system. For instance, the Bible gives us the length of the reigns of the Judean and Israelite kings, and it will date events to a certain year within the reign of a specific king. So, for example, 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 1 and 2, date the destruction of Jerusalem to the 11th year of King Zedekiah, who's the last of the Judean kings. That information alone doesn't tell us enough to date the event in a way that allows us to know much about how much time has passed since the 11th year of King Zedekiah to, let's say, today's date. I'm recording this on November 10, 2023. How much time has taken place between the 11th year of King Zedekiah to today? We don't know. That is, we don't know if we're using the Bible alone. Why is that? As we just mentioned, the Bible does include within it chronological information. For instance, it tells us about the length of time that a particular king was sitting on the throne, and it gives us this information going from the reign of Zedekiah all the way back to King Saul. And supposing, for instance, that this information about the length of the reigns of kings is accurate, you can tell how much time has elapsed from the beginning of the Israelite monarchy, with the beginning of the reign of King Saul, to the reign of King Zedekiah. However, there is no biblical document telling us how much time elapsed from the reign of Zedekiah to the birth of Jesus. There is no text that bridges this roughly 500-year gap between the reconstruction of Jerusalem and the beginning of the New Testament period. And actually, even then, we would still be at a loss as to how to date things in relationship to our own time. To do what Charles Taze Russell and the Watchtower does, that is, arguing that 1914 is the terminal date of a 2,520-year period, you have to know how much time has elapsed between the biblical period and our day. And again, there is nothing within the Bible itself that gives us this information. To do this, you have to synchronize the Bible's relative chronology, its relative dates, with what's called an absolute chronology. Here's a nifty quote that Jonsson includes in the book. It's from a Dr. Michael C. Astor, who's written a work on Hittite history and chronology. He defines absolute chronology as a means of dating reigns, wars, treaties, destructions, rebuildings, and other events known from written and archaeological records in terms of modern Western time reckoning, i.e., in years BC. In other words, to connect the ancient world to our time that allows us to assign a date like 539 BCE to the destruction of Babylon requires us to reconstruct the chronology from, you guessed it, secular evidence. And as Jonsson also notes, the Bible could have allowed us to bypass the need for secular evidence to date events within it if it had provided us with astronomical data. For instance, if the Bible dated events like solar eclipses within its relative framework, we would be able to use modern astronomical methods to date events in the Bible. But the Bible doesn't give us this kind of data. So, if we want to come up with this date that Watchtower uses, we have to use extra biblical evidence. So let's return to the quote from Let Your Kingdom Come, from the appendix in that book. We are willing to be guided primarily by God's word, rather than by a chronology that is based principally on secular evidence, or that disagrees with the scriptures. What's bizarre about this statement is that Franz and the organization are very much aware that you have no choice but to use secular evidence to come up with their date. And not only does the organization appeal to secular evidence in general to argue for their date, but they actually do that in this very same appendix, in this article. So it makes you wonder about these kinds of statements. Is it really meant to outline their model, their method, or is it just to leave an impression on the uninformed reader that if they disagree with the organization's chronology, somehow they're disagreeing with the Bible? The Watchtower is aware that you need to construct an absolute chronology in order to produce the dates in their system. And when they do so, they almost always mention secular evidence that they need to support their chronology. But on the other hand, they have never actually discussed much of it in detail. This tendency, and really the fundamental problem of creating an absolute chronology, goes back to how Barber and Russell originally set out to date the destruction of Jerusalem. When Barber and Russell co-wrote Three Worlds, or Plan of Redemption, they date the destruction of Jerusalem by attempting, first of all, to date the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, which they date to 536 BCE. We'll talk in a second about how they arrive at 536 BCE. And then they say that the first year of Cyrus is in the year that Babylon was captured by the Medes and Persians. And they assume that the 70 years of desolation that are mentioned in Jeremiah are the years of the exile. That is, the years counting from the destruction of Jerusalem to the destruction of Babylon. When you count backward from their first year of Cyrus and 536 BCE, 70 years, you land on 606 BCE. Barber says that he gets the dating of the first year of Cyrus, and hence the destruction of Babylon, the date 536 BCE, from Ptolemy's canon. There are problems with almost every part of this reckoning, one of which is that Ptolemy's canon doesn't actually date Cyrus' first year to 536 BCE. Barber simply asserts that this is what Ptolemy's canon tells us. Well, eventually, C.T. Russell finds out that Ptolemy's canon doesn't actually say anything like this, and it actually dates Cyrus' first year to 538 BCE. So, Russell starts to attack the credibility of Ptolemy's canon. He actually asserts all students of chronology may be said to be agreed that the first year of Cyrus was the year 536, before the beginning of our Anno Domini era. Russell is just saying this, and he couldn't possibly be more wrong. And some of the Bible students are starting to find out. For instance, Paul S.L. Jonsson, a popular figure and writer in the Bible student movement, wrote a private letter to Russell saying, "Hey, I've checked a dozen encyclopedias. All of them say Cyrus' first year is 538, not 536. Russell just ignores this fact. And as discussed in the previous video, he sticks with his dating system, not because of the historical data, but because he's committed to his eschatology. He sees harmonies in his system. This way of constructing an absolute chronology, by reaching for the first year of King Cyrus and lining that up with the destruction of Babylon, ends up being inherited by Rutherford when he cements 1914 as the terminal date of his calculation. During the Knorr and Franz era, there was more attention paid to this subject. Along with it, there were fresh attempts to construct an absolute chronology that acknowledged what Russell didn't, that the first year of Cyrus was in fact in 538 BCE. But this is where things start to get really strange. Fred Franz, it seems, is aware of some of the problems, yet he's repeating the same pattern of merely gesturing toward historical or archaeological data to justify an absolute chronology that works for Watchtower. Starting in 1952, the Watchtower begins to set 539 BCE as, quote, the absolute date for the Hebrew scriptures by various appeals. Initially, they refer to the Nabonidus Chronicle as the means through which an absolute chronology can be constructed. The problem is that the Nabonidus Chronicle only tells us that the fall of Babylon was in the 17th year of Nabonidus. That on its own doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you about when you would date the 17th year of Nabonidus. You can't build an absolute chronology out of it. You can't, on that basis, say that the fall of Babylon was in 539 BCE, because the 17th year of Nabonidus being the same year that Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians, that's all it gives you. But in the pages of the Watchtower and in the inspired book, they just insist that this tablet gives us a specific date. Starting in 1971, when work was being done on the subject of chronology for the book Aid to Bible Understanding, they no longer appealed to the Nabonidus Chronicle and started appealing to other kinds of secular evidence to construct an absolute chronology. Here's the quote from the Watchtower that, for the first time, appeals to these other secular sources to justify their absolute chronology. Also, other sources, including Ptolemy's canon, point to the year 539 BCE as the date for Babylon's fall. For example, ancient historians such as Diodorus, Africanus, and Eusebius show that Cyrus' first year as king of Persia corresponded to Olympiad 55, year 1, 560-559 BCE, while Cyrus' last year is placed at Olympiad 62, year 2, 531-530 BCE. Cuneiform tablets give Cyrus a rule of 9 years over Babylon. This would harmonize with the accepted date for the start of his rule over Babylon in 539 BCE. I actually remember personally myself reading this statement in the Insight book where it later appears, and I remember starting to think about how Watchtower creates its chronology and thinking it was kind of remarkable that their entire chronology hung upon these sources, which they don't actually quote from or explore in any more depth in their article about chronology in the Insight book. Well, Jonsson invites us to examine these sources that they are using to construct their absolute chronology. First, you can see the quote refers to Ptolemy's canon, which we've already talked about a little bit. Ptolemy's canon is a king list that was compiled in the 2nd century CE by Claudius Ptolemy. The issue with Watchtower using this document as a way to construct an absolute chronology is they actually reject Ptolemy's dates. And this is because Ptolemy's canon would date the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, and therefore the destruction of Jerusalem, to the year 587 BCE. Watchtower also rejects 2 other figures given by Ptolemy for the dates of Persian kings for other reasons. So on the one hand, they want to appeal to Ptolemy's canon, but on the other hand, they want to reject aspects of the canon. But if you do that, you can't build it into an absolute chronology. All of the dates would end up getting shifted over depending upon what dates you reject. And actually, there would be a statement from the Watchtower not long after they start making the appeal to Ptolemy's canon that reverses that appeal by saying the very purpose of the canon, that is Ptolemy's canon, makes absolute dating by means of it impossible. Well, what about their second historical witness, the Greek Olympiads? The Greek Olympiad was a list of the winners of the Olympic Games, and each Olympiad is the time period between each of the Olympics. The first year assigned to this era is designated O1I1, which would correlate with 776 BCE. The convention of dating the Olympics this way didn't actually appear until the 3rd century BCE. And the Greek historians of the 3rd century are looking at lists of the winners of various Olympic Games, and they're assuming that they've always been held in these exact intervals. These are 4-year intervals. And actually, we know that the Olympics, at least early on, were not held in these exact 4-year intervals. Further, these lists of Olympic winners were composed by Hippias at the end of the 5th century BCE. So the first compiler of this list of winners was not actually around to witness these winners. Of course, he's relying on other documents and witnesses to these events. So both of these issues combine to make the Olympiads a less than reliable source for constructing an absolute chronology. Historians today do not lean on the Olympiads to build an absolute chronology. Additionally, you actually have the same problem here that you have with Ptolemy's canon. That is the same problem that Watchtower has with Ptolemy's canon. Watchtower wants to accept the date it gives for the first year of Cyrus' reign, but it rejects the date it gives for other reigns in its list. For instance, using the Olympiads, you would date the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes to 445 BCE. Watchtower wants to date this 10 years earlier for reasons we can discuss later. And like we said before, you literally can't have it both ways. You have to either accept 445 is the 20th year of Artaxerxes I, or you don't get 539 BCE as the first year of Cyrus. So far, this is not looking great for Watchtower's attempts to create an absolute chronology that we can use to date events in the biblical period. In the 1980s, articles start to appear that appeal to astronomical data that fixes the first year of the reign of Cyrus to 539 BCE. Mind you, we're not yet talking about how we date the destruction of Jerusalem. We're still asking how the Watchtower creates a dating system that connects our modern era with the biblical period. And astronomical data could be a way to do that. Clay tablets have been uncovered since the Babylonian era, and they sometimes mention astronomical phenomena. They'll say in these tablets that they saw, for example, a lunar eclipse take place in such and such a year in the reign of their king. We can then use our modern knowledge of astronomy to calculate how long ago that particular lunar eclipse took place and correlate that with the data the tablet provides to confirm our absolute chronology. And, as we'll see later, that doesn't actually work out well for Watchtower because these tablets that we have point to the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE, not 607. However, Watchtower wants to use astronomical data to support their absolute chronology. The Insight book actually appeals to these lines of evidence. It refers to an astronomical text that's designated STRM Cambis 400, which mentions 2 lunar eclipses. The Insight book says, "Thus, the tablet establishes the 7th year of Cambyses II as beginning in the spring of 523 BCE, which would be right. But then you're forced to appeal to other ancient documents to count backward from the reign of this king to the first year of Cyrus the Persian, because otherwise you don't actually know how much time has elapsed from the 7th year of Cambyses II to the first year of Cyrus the Great." In addition, Jonsson notes that scholars in general do not think that this tablet is among the most accurate witnesses to the historical data, but for the sake of the argument, you can put that aside. And as Jonsson concludes this chapter, he notes that Watchtower has made a kind of desperate and last-ditch appeal to astronomy to construct an absolute chronology so that a timeline can be created. But, on the other hand, it rejects astronomical and archaeological data when it doesn't agree with their dating of the destruction of Jerusalem. And really, as Jonsson shows us, that's it. That's all the Watchtower has to appeal to come up with a chronology that can synchronize with our modern period. Watchtower, over and over, has merely gestured toward historical and secular data without any further explanation. In our next video, we will start to talk about each of the 17, and yes, there are 17 lines of evidence that demonstrates that Jerusalem was destroyed in 587 BCE.